Hi everyone, I'm Jennifer Acker from the Indo-American Arts Council. We are a 21-year-old organization centered in New York City, and we are dedicated to promoting the arts and artists of Indian heritage, showcasing the performing, visual, and literary arts. Gold Diggers, the acclaimed debut novel by Sanjena Sathian, is a uniquely Indian American story. It's a story of true love and ambition and the bewildering question of heritage. Our protagonist is first-generation American named Neil, an ABCD, an American-born Stacy, who as a child, alongside his love Anita, becomes seduced into poaching the powers and prowess of others through drinking their gold. Along the way, he learns hard lessons about himself and the history of his country, and we're delighted to host Sanjena today.
Happy to be here.
A Paul and Daisy Soros Fellow, Sanjena Sathian is a 2019 graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. She has worked as a reporter in Mumbai and San Francisco with nonfiction bylines for The New Yorker, The New York Times, Food and Wine, The Washington Post, Vox, and Time, and more. Her award-winning short fiction has been published in The Atlantic, Conjunctions, Boulevard, Joyland, Salt Hill, and The Master's Review. Gold Diggers is her first novel, and it's available for purchase at bookshop.org, as well as many, many other places, your local bookstore. And today I'm also very happy to introduce Jafreen Uddin, who will be in conversation with Sanjena today. Hi, Jafreen.
Hi, Jennifer. Hi, Sanjena.
Jafreen was appointed Executive Director of the Asian American Writers Workshop in January 2020. She is the first woman to lead the organization since its founding in 1991. Previously, she served as Deputy Director of Development for Special Events with PEN America, and her current service roles include being Chair of the Adult Internship Committee for We Need Diverse Books, and a Literary Council member for the Brooklyn Book Festival. So please join me in welcoming Sanjena and Jafreen today. Take it away.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hi, Sanjena.
Hi, Jafreen. It's great to meet you.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be in conversation. Jennifer gave a quick summary of the book, but I'm going to encourage everyone who's watching, if you haven't read it already, to please do so. But yeah, let's get right into it. Sanjena, so, immigrant identity stories, I think a lot of times get put into a box and can feel a little bit limiting. And one of the things that I loved most about this book is how it tells this, very universal, very relatable immigrant identity story. And it's ultimately about belonging, but it uses, magical realism, which is this fantastic, fun genre. Can you tell us a little bit about your decision to write in this particular genre and, what about it allowed you to tell the story that you wanted to tell? And really just, how did that choice of genre really play into your creative process?
Yeah. I do think that being in a box is a tricky thing. Anytime you start writing, there's this desire to sort of do what feels familiar. And I think what feels familiar to a lot of Americans in immigrant narrative is sort of a domestic family story with some kind of tension between the first generation and the second, and then a nice reconciliation across generations. And I think there are so many ways to tell that kind of story. And in many ways, my book actually does do that. It has the sort of components of the domestic story. It has a family story. It has all of that. But I was totally unable to get access to that until I started writing speculative fiction. So I was writing basically realism for a really long time. And then partway through sort of my 20s, I started to notice that my realism was just not very good. It was flat, it was boring, it was not playful. And I just went on this kick of reading largely speculative fiction writers. So people who are writing magic realism, people who are writing sort of what people will sometimes call slipstream or surrealism. And then a little bit of, like real fantasy and sort of hard sci-fi. But I was really interested in the stuff that's in that borderland space between the real and unreal. And by going down this really intense rabbit hole for about 2 or 3 years, I discovered kind of my own language for magical realism. Like I had grown up reading Rushdie and Marquez and people who do the most kind of famous versions of magical realism. But there's this modern thing that I think people from like Carmen Maria Machado to Amy Bender play with, that is, you change one or two small variables in existing reality, and then you see how that sort of snowballs and how that changes the rest of reality. And it gives you a way to heighten the realism instead of taking you away from the real. And so that's what I did when I was thinking about starting this book. I was interested in the idea of gold theft and how that happens in the suburbs. It's actually a real thing that happened in a bunch of suburbs around the country, kind of wherever there were Indians, there was gold. And people were stealing it. But I was interested in what might happen if I added a dash of magic in there. And what happened was this magical device that snowballed, and it gave the book its own momentum. And I could sort of trick myself into writing the parts of realism that felt really scary to me before, and the parts that felt hard before.
Yeah, no, I love that. That was one of the things that I loved most about it. It even it's this fantastic story, but it kind of felt like it could happen. Like I could imagine people like in a basement drinking gold. Why not? The other thing I think about a lot in terms of, challenges that, writers of color face is there's a very kind of specific burden of thinking about audience in ways that white writers often do not. And, one of the ways that it kind of manifests itself in a book is this decision of, do you italicize or not italicize certain words? And I loved your book for a lot of reasons, but I think one of the things that I loved most about it is that, words like I and aji and, bisibile bat, like these weren't italicized. And so I'd love to hear just your thought process. Was it something you intentionally thought about? Did it kind of organically happen? And kind of parallel to that, how does a decision, even just as kind of structural as that, play into your idea of, who's in your front row? Who are you writing for? Who's the audience you're thinking about when you're writing?
Yeah. That's such a specific question that I almost feel like you're in my head, because that was a really important starting point around audience for me. When I was in grad school, the first workshop I went to, I turned in a story that was set in Bombay, and the characters were, I think two of them were Indian American, one of them was Indian and born and raised in Bombay. And I had italicized all the Hindi words, and there wasn't a ton of Hindi, but it was English. It was set in Bombay. And this woman in my workshop who was native, she's Northern Cheyenne, she wrote in my workshop letter, she was like, I don't understand why these are italicized. Like, who is that for? Like when I use language that like would be really common on the reservation, like I would just leave it in there because it's the language that these people speak to each other. So, she was really good about saying, here's where I am on this, and that I'm just offering you this alternative. And it felt so obvious, but I had always seen things italicized. So I just thought that was like this implicit rule that you had to follow. And I tried to sort of carry that confidence going forward, and really, really carry that into my future work. And that, I think, over the course of grad school, I ended up having to get more comfortable with not just throwing different bits of language, but throwing full ideas into each story that I was messing with. And sometimes that meant like doing kind of a deep cut, and it didn't always work. Like I wrote a story in graduate school that involved like a sci-fi device that was like a pocket universe that let you into this universe where Indians had figured out how to do like retirement homes in a way that they liked. And it was drawing on this Hindu idea of the 4 stages of life, one of which is retirement. And it was a crazy looping thing to fit into a 6,000 word short story. It really didn't work, but at least I was learning to go there. And often I think having a mix of readers has been really helpful, because that's my friend group. I'll have readers who are very familiar with the world I'm writing about, and readers who know nothing about it, but know me and know my world. And so having my friends and my kind of core writing community be fairly diverse has been really important for that. There's also one little story that I think of often now. when I think about who your audience is. My friend, the novelist Andrew Ridker, who is Jewish, he and I love the movie A Serious Man by the Coen brothers, which I think is their like most Jewish, most immigrant, like assimilation movie that like no one watches, but it's amazing. And it has these little rabbinical parables sort of sprinkled throughout, where the main character, who's basically a modern day Job, keeps going to his rabbi and being like, help me, rabbi, why am I suffering? And at some point, the rabbi tells him this weird little story about a goy who is found to have Hebrew letters etched on the inside of his teeth. And no one can figure out what the Hebrew is about. The whole story is about, like, how do we interpret these letters? And at the end of the little parable, the protagonist goes, well, what happened to the goy? And the rabbi goes, the goy, who cares? And Andrew and I would talk about that all the time when we were thinking about our own work, is just you have to have that little energy of like, the goy, who cares? Because that's kind of how things are in your own community. Like if I were sitting around the dinner table and my mom was telling a story, some gossipy little story about someone in the community who had married a white person, all of the drama would be centered in the community. And if we wanted to know if there had been a divorce, like what happened to the white person, she would have been like, I don't know, they're outside of my realm of consideration. Like what we care about is that like Sonia auntie is divorced and what do we do about that? So I think it's really hard to do as soon as you know about the market and as soon as you start to learn about all the things that I know you think about all the time, which is how publishing works, how numbers look different for writers of color. But if you can try to have that really private space that I think you can cultivate with other writers, then I think that freedom can come. But it definitely requires work.
Yes, I love that. You definitely need to, I feel like writers need to be particularly like possessive of their kind of creative license and be a little selfish in, you know, the story that they want to tell versus what, you know, an agent or editor or whoever might be like, even unintentionally, you know, kind of showing some kind of bias. So in the story, so many of the characters confront this question, you know, both directly and indirectly of, and I loved how you worded it, what does it mean to be both Indian and like American? And what I love about, you know, your particular story is you kind of take, it's a very flattened idea of identity. And so you take that and you really turn it on its head. And so I'd love to hear why it was important for you, not just as a writer, as a person of South Asian descent, you know, why was it important to really kind of interrogate and satirize this kind of what's turned into a cliche, right, of what it means to be a third culture kid?
Yeah. I think the book is both really interested in that question and really annoyed at its own interest in that question, which is a reflection entirely on me. I think growing up in the South as a South Asian and, you know, at the time, like no one was even saying the phrase South Asian. So it really felt narrowly like I was this Indian kid and I had bushy eyebrows and I felt weird. And, you know, I think those are real things that deeply affect our day-to-day experience of feeling otherized. But I also think it's really important to treat that with a lighter touch when we get older so that, A, we can sort of see how some of those questions can feel different in adulthood. And also specifically in the corner of the Indian diaspora that I'm writing about, which is predominantly Hindu dominant caste and upper middle class. I think that sometimes these questions of identity can take on outsized importance and mean that we forget about the relative privilege that exists in this particular corner of the diaspora. And also forget about how flattening that is for the entire kind of attempt to say something about larger South Asian identity, which is obviously kind of a ridiculous idea in itself. But it's this way of, we risk being too self-indulgent, and we risk, I think, not placing ourselves in the larger context of America's race and class landscape. And so part of the way that I feel like I've grown into those identity questions is thinking about history and also thinking about it with just a little bit of a sense of play of saying, obviously, these are real, these affect our internal psychology. but also this version of the diaspora is assimilating fast, and I am much more interested in challenging people like me to be critical of the values that we amass as we assimilate, rather than only saying over and over again, like, it's so hard to be different. I think we have to be able to hold both of those things.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And I think a lot about, there was a piece in the New York Times by J. Caspian King about the term Asian America. And the part that always sticks out to me is where he's like, the guy delivering your Uber delivery is like not thinking about what it means to be Asian American. And, you know, there's so many kind of different stories that take place in this big tent that we often get lumped into. So we think a lot at the workshop about really sitting in that tension and interrogating it. And I love that your book also did that. You mentioned history. Another thing that's so wonderful about your book is its use of history in how it tells the story. And it's such a nice reminder that our traditions and our ancestors, you know, stay with us in ways that are, you know, interesting, but also kind of unknown a lot of the time. And I was so fascinated by the story of the Bombayan gold digger in particular. When you were doing this kind of historical research for the book, what was like a super interesting or surprising fact or tidbit or just like nugget of knowledge that you kind of picked up while doing that research?
Yeah. So much. I've been fascinated by South Asian American history for maybe 7 years now. That's not even a category of history I knew existed growing up. I thought we were a fairly new diaspora because people came here after 1965. But when I moved to California, I started reading and learning more about the textures of the South Asian diaspora pre-1965, sometimes even pre-1917. And learning that it was a very different looking diaspora. Like, this is pre everyone thinking that we're all doctors and engineers. This is a more working class diaspora. It had a lot more Punjabis and Sikhs, and a lot more Muslims and Bengalis. And there's this, I think we've just forgotten how much more texture there was to early immigration to the US before sort of lots of quotas and H-1B visas became like the way that people had to get here. And so I was interested in incorporating something about that history, particularly because I was already writing something that was set on the West Coast, since the second half of the book takes place in Silicon Valley. And you can't make this stuff up. Like, everyone calls Silicon Valley a gold rush, and I was already writing about gold. So I was like, there's some overlap here. And so I wanted to have sort of a history subplot. I started looking into a bunch of different historical time periods, trying to figure out where it would fit in naturally. And I wrote some really forced sections that I had to throw away. There was an entire like mini novella set in 1914 that had absolutely nothing to do with the book that really needed to get tossed. But I went back and was like, I should just look for like the on the nose thing. I should see if there was any South Asian presence in the gold rush in 1849. And I started doing a lot of research. I think it's pretty well known now that there were a lot of Chinese workers who came and built the railroads, who were put through horrible living conditions. You know, books like How Much of These Hills is Gold by C. Pham Jung is really, like, they have sort of done amazing work looking at that time period. But I had never heard of a South Asian being in the US during the gold rush. I emailed historians. I read a lot of books. I was finding nothing. And then sort of just when I was giving up, I found this travelogue in the Library of Congress archive, just uploaded digitally. And it was written by this racist German man. It was these little snippets, vignettes of life through 1849. And suddenly the last chapter was a story of a figure he just called the Hindu, or the Bombayan. And it's this story of basically a lynch mob, told from the white man's perspective, where he says they come across this dark-skinned man and they blame him, they accuse him of stealing gold, and they chase him down, and they basically try to kill him. And I had no idea what happened to this man. I struggled to find any corroboration of his existence. In the end, through a friend who is a great community historian, I learned that we found like one little clipping in like the San Francisco Gazette maybe 3 years later saying there was a Hindustani found dead in a mining camp. And I was like, is it the same guy? Who knows? And I was just fascinated by all of the gaps in that story. You know, how does that figure end up getting to America at that time? It's a little easier to get from Hong Kong or China or Singapore. There's one boat that'll take you to California. But to get out of out of British controlled, East India controlled India, to get then to potentially Hong Kong or Malaysia or Singapore, and then to get to California, that would have required some cunning, some accident. And I was like, it would be really interesting to sort of write into everything I don't know, while also giving Neil, the main character, some of the questions I had, the haunting feeling of no matter how much you know, there is still this enormous gulf between our subjective experience today and whatever that person's emotional landscape was, because we'll never know, because there's no voice for a lot of those people in American history.
Yeah, it's just such a reminder that there's such a gap between like what we're taught as the history and what probably or did, happen, and we kind of take the scraps that we get and imagine, right? On the other side of that, I think today we're in this what feels like a hyper visible moment for Asian Americans and Asian America across so many genres. There's so many good books of literature coming out, yours included, film, television. What, as a writer, does this moment kind of feel different for you compared to what we grew up with? And also just what is exciting you about, what's coming out and what other Asian and South Asian creatives are working on?
Yeah, it's definitely exciting. I mean, the writer Viet Thanh Nguyen has this phrase, narrative plentitude, that I think is such a wonderful goal, and we're getting closer to it being a reality. Just this idea that when there are more of you making stuff, all of the burden of representation is not put on one person. And the conversations about representation in this like narrow and flat way are just the most annoying things ever to have. We succumb to this like whataboutism, like if we don't see ourselves directly represented in someone else's piece of art, and that's the only art that's out there, of course we're going to be like, well, what about me? I'm not in there. And everyone is telling me that like the entirety of Indian American experience is contained in Jhumpa Lahiri's novels. Those can't stand up to that burden. That's way too much. We don't put it on anyone else. You know this. So I think we're in this exciting moment where not only is the burden of representation lifted, but aesthetically we're all getting to try new stuff. And we're being allowed to actually be artists and not just tell the stories, chronicle the stories of like our own people, and like just be sort of like, it's not our job to just bear those as vessels. So one of the books that I've loved this year that has done that is by my friend Anthony Diaz-Nassau, who passed away last year. And in addition to like the loss of him as a person, reading his book After Parties, Khmer American writer, you just see it like brimming with voice and risk taking, and like there's a different spark on every single page that talk about freedom. Another book that is coming out next year that I know Sarah Thunga Matthews, but her book All This Could Be Different is just it's this beautiful queer coming of age kind of love story about a whole group of people, not just like this individualistic love story. And it's like politically radical. It's also just sexy. And like, that's a book that I could never have dreamed of seeing a few years ago. And then I also like to point people to a few books in the past. Hanif Qureshi's The Book of Suburbia was so important to me, and I think is weirdly underread, maybe because it came out in 1990. But I also like to point people to that book in case they haven't read it, because I think it proves that like there were always people doing radical, that's a queer story, that's a like badly behaved immigrant story. So I think like we have a lot of literary ancestors available to us, and we have to make sure that we don't like trace our lineage to just one type of person and just one type of aesthetic.
Yeah, no, I love the narrative plenitude that Vietton always talks about. I think it's so important. And I think the funniest commentary that I remember reading about it was when that Netflix show Bling Empire came out, and I think it was like a Vanity Fair article, and the writer was like, this is a mediocre show, and it's such progress for us that, you know, we've made it to a point where we're now a part of like mediocre reality shows. And I think that's a big piece of it also. It's, you know, it's a diversity in types of stories as much as anything. So your book came out earlier this year. You know, we're in this pandemic. It's such a weird time. How, you know, what was it like to release a book during this time? How, if at all, did you find kind of moments of like book release normalcy in the middle of this strange and uncertain time?
Yeah. I mean, you probably know more about what it's like in the normal world than I do, because this is the first time I'm going through any of it. But it was definitely strange and sort of isolating to release this thing that was just a Word document for so long into the world and just not know if anyone was going to receive it. You know, it's so vulnerable, and it's so scary that your baby might not be loved, as one of my therapists very kindly put it. I think some of the really cool stuff has been getting to have conversations with just other people who love literature. And I think so much of book publishing is, and more than I realized, it's about choosing the right cover. It's about tracking sales numbers. And like, I just genuinely, maybe I was naive, I didn't think about any of those things. I thought about not the book world, but the literary world. And one of the things that has been wonderful has been finding people within the book world who care just as much about the art as possible. Like, one of the highlights of my tour was getting to do a conversation with Karan Mahajan for the Harvard Bookstore that just felt like the literarily geekiest conversation you could have. And just to know that even though we're all subject to like the vagaries of the market, all of us are still out there doing this work because we love words and we love stories, and like we all have the like kid who was sitting at the public library energy in us still. So hopefully that's normal. I hope I get that next time too.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, just as, you know, obviously the workshop is involved in kind of putting together conversations like that, and the one kind of, you know, I hate the term silver lining, but because I feel like it minimizes the tragedy, but, you know, one thing that did happen in the past couple of years is we could pair authors from like all corners of the world. We did an event with, you know, Rajiv Mohabir and Kazim Ali and Sheila Chandra, and like Kazim's on the West Coast, Rajiv's on the East Coast, and Sheila was in London. And it was the kind of thing that could only happen, you know, on Zoom and in this moment. So yeah, there have been kind of some moments of normalcy, I feel like. And along those lines, yeah. Along those lines, how has the pandemic impacted your creative practice? You know, has it paused? Or, you know, what are you doing to creatively sustain yourself these days?
Question. I think the combination of the pandemic and releasing a book definitely interrupted my writing process for a while. There was something about how suddenly public life became, like a really small thing that kind of messed with my head for a while. That seems really silly, but I did this panel for the LA Times Book Festival, and I did it from my desk because that's where I was doing everything. And then someone rated it on Room Raters on Twitter. And, you know, it was mixed feedback on the setup of my Zoom background. And then I was like, I have to go write at that desk tomorrow. And like, the world saw it, and there was something so embarrassing about that. So I moved into a new place. My Zoom corner is not my writing corner anymore. Like, I have them in different spaces. And I think that sort of just speaks to like creative process and how private it is. I have needed to remind myself of how disgustingly messy my first drafts are. And just because other people are engaging now with the final draft of a thing, I need to remember, like, every time I do a reading that, like, those sentences were not always those sentences. There were like 10 clauses I cut from every single one. And so I think a lot of what I've been doing has just been spending time reading again, being with other people's work. I've been reading a lot of friends' work, getting to sort of like start blurbing and giving back to all of the, like, really needing to pay it forward because so many people were so helpful. And yeah, just developing the private relationship with books and writing. I write by hand when I'm trying to remind myself to be messy as well, which is a tactic I took from the comic book artist Linda Barry, whose work is amazing. For anyone who's ever stuck, get her book, Making Comics. Yeah, I think we just have to remind ourselves of the sort of primordial parts of the creative process.
Yeah. That juxtaposition is always so interesting, because, to me at least, because writing, it's such a solitary practice, but then your community of writers are so kind of critical to, like, getting through that solitary practice. So that duality of the craft is always so fascinating to me, as somebody who is not a writer and doesn't have a creative practice. So Gold Diggers has been picked up by Mindy Kaling's production company to be adapted into a television series. First of all, that's amazing. Congratulations. I'd love to hear more. At the workshop, we think a lot about expanding the definition of what it means to be a writer. And part of that includes, like, screenwriting and writing for TV and writing for film. What can you tell us about the project? What's your involvement? And is there something that you're excited about, kind of TV bringing out of the story, that maybe you couldn't do with the written word?
Well, I'm still writing adaptation, and if it does get made, I'll be co-executive producer, so I get to be pretty involved. I am working with someone who is much more experienced in screenwriting, who's a showrunner, and that kind of connects to what you're talking about, because it is a completely different kind of narrative intelligence. And, like, as a story geek, it's just so cool to see how someone else, in screenwriting, they talk about breaking a story, which is, like, such a weird phrase for me. I'm like, you can't break down the story, it's complete. But actually, like, breaking it over the course of a season, or over the course of an episode, has been so cool structurally, because I start to see, oh, you can pull this thing from the end, put it in the middle, and all of a sudden that's an interesting turn in the middle of this episode. We've talked a little bit about shifting time periods. So the second half of the book takes place in 2016, and maybe we want to make that present day to sort of bring it into the now. The thing that I'm most excited about has been, I've heard from actors and from some directors in Hollywood, just a lot of South Asian creatives, and it seems like everyone kind of keeps a really careful watch on stuff that gets optioned, because there's still a shortage of stories that, like, these incredible performers, like, they're all competing for the same ones. And so it's been really interesting to me. I thought this was like a not a piece of news at all, but people have paid attention, I think, because we need more of these stories. So if it actually gets made, like, this is a book that has very few speaking parts for non-South Asians. Really, for, like, there's like a Nigerian American character, there's, like, other Asian American characters, but, like, the white roles are pretty limited, a la Crazy Rich Asians. So that will, like, visually just feel, I think, still relatively new. So I'm excited about bringing that stuff out. Too. But screenwriting is definitely writing, and it is really hard in new and exciting ways.
I love that. Yeah, no, I'm best of luck. It sounds, I was even just thinking about how, like, beautiful it would look. Gold, and, like, well, it's going to be just such a visually gorgeous, project. So my last question, we think a lot at the workshop about joy and joy as a subversive force, as a force of resistance. And so, to that end, what is bringing you joy these days? What are you reading or watching or eating or kind of what are you doing to hold on to joy in this moment?
I'm going to take that last one because food always brings me joy. But I recently bought myself a $12 bamboo cookbook stand. It is the best thing that you can have if you like cooking, because I walk into my kitchen and I have the recipe that I'm trying to make like laid out for me the night before. I've been really enjoying this cookbook called East by Mira Soda. It's like a tour through East, Southeast Asian, and South Asian cuisines, all vegetarian and many of them vegan friendly. And they're very doable and they're fresh and interesting. And I just have been loving working with my hands and making my own food. And I'm about to be in London for a month, which I think just has, if you subtract all of the actual British food, it's got the best food in the world. So I'm excited to just eat my way through London.
Yeah, the Indian food is in particular is just amazing.
Totally.
It's like the best Indian food in London, of all places. Sanjena, this has been such a treat. Thank you so much. To everybody watching, if you haven't read this already, get your copy at your local bookshop. Read it. It's amazing. And thank you for the conversation. Thank you for your work. And I can't, wait to see what comes next.
Thank you so much. Thanks to IAAC and the Asian American Writers Workshop. Appreciate you both.
That was so wonderful. Thank you both so much. I really enjoyed eavesdropping on this conversation while you were having it. I wonder if I could end with one additional question that I've been thinking about your book, Sanjena. So there's this thread of ambition throughout the book and the ambivalence towards ambition. And ambition, of course, can be a very taboo topic for women, or just to sort of state that one has certain ambitions can be difficult. And so I wonder, in writing this book, did it urge you to think about ambition in your own life differently, to reorient your own ambition, to treat it differently, cultivate it differently? Is there anything there that you could speak to?
Yeah, I mean, I think mostly it's highlighted my own hypocrisy because I wrote this book that's very critical of ambition, and in doing so, realized that I am still really ambitious. And I think talking about this book constantly and having a lot of conversations about it, like I really have to continue engaging with the critiques that I have leveled here. I think I could only level them because they're sort of against me. So I'm really critical of the striving that I think I grew up with, and being told like that was the core value that I needed to sort of embody, and finding out all the ways in which I am still addicted to this thing that the book is really critical of is really important, because I think it's easy to like moral high horse about it, but I'm still stuck in it. I don't think that societally we've found a lot of great ways to wean ourselves off of ambition as this like unadulterated drug, and so yeah, I'm still working through it. Yeah,
that's really well put, and I appreciate your honesty and the way that that you put that, which is true for so many of us. So thank you both so much on behalf of the IAAC. I'd really like to thank Sanjena and Jafreen again for this beautiful conversation. Again, yes, Gold Diggers, it's beautiful. Please pick it up. And for those who are watching, please join us for our next program. You can go to the IAAC.us website, and we'll see you next time.